As ever with English language and literature exams, exam technique is so critical. It's all very well having a brilliant understanding of a text, in this case measure for measure, but if you don't give the examiner what he or she is looking for, you sure as hell ain't going to get that top grade. This video will give you crucial tips on exam technique for question A from the Shakespeare question for the OCR A-level English Literature, Drama and Poetry pre-1900 paper and increase your chances of getting an A-star. So, stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Le grammatiche sono per me. E poi non gosto se dá para não ser morteza.
Não vês que sou eu?
Let's kick off with the mark scheme for this question. There are two assessment objectives, AO1 and AO2.
So AO1 is about your arguments, informed by the breadth of your understanding about the text. It's about how well and how accurately you write.
Whereas AO2 is about how meanings are shaped within the play, or in other words, how the writer uses language, form and structure for effect. Crucially, for this question, 75% of the marks are for AO2. Put simply, if you don't have loads of quotations and explorations of these quotations, you sure as hell ain't going to get into the top bands. And this is what the top band of the mark scheme looks like. Well, for the 25%, your argument and writing need to be excellent rather than good or competent. You need to be showing a consistently detailed understanding of the play, aided by those numerous short, insightful quotations. Goes without saying that your argument needs to be brilliantly, accurately written and structured. And of course, the more you write and read essays, the more this will come. But this is only the 25%. The 75% lies with assessment objective 2. The best responses will ensure that they discuss and develop the meaning and effects of language, form and structure in consistent detail. Using effortlessly embedded quotations. Let's start with some individual examples of what this might look like. It is Act 2, Scene 2, and Isabella, following a slow start, is warming up to her task of being more persuasive. Her aim is to somehow convince Angelo to reduce her brother Claudio's death sentence for fornication. Here's what a past pupil wrote in relation to this section of the extracts. In Act 2, Scene 2, Angelo is depicted time and again as the figure with all the power. At the end of his opening speech, he commands Isabella to be satisfied, be content. His use of imperatives indicate that he is in a position to command Isabella, and she accepts this, describing him as having a giant strength. All this serves to reinforce that Angelo holds the power in this scene. The onus is on Isabella to convince him that he is in the wrong. What do we make of this response? What band might it get within the mark scheme? Well, when it comes to AO2, the top band requires the discussion of language to be well developed and consistently detailed. Is this the case here? Well, we have some explanation of the effects of Angelo's imperatives. These are appropriate given the unequal positions of power between the two, with him being temporarily in charge of Vienna and Isabella a mere nun in training. However, this point takes up only half a sentence, and cannot be said to be particularly well developed or consistently detailed. Indeed, the pupil quickly moves on to embed a different quotation, a giant strength, before grouping the two generally to effectively repeat or slightly develop the same points about Angelo's power. So, could this be in the band below level 5, which requires the discussion of the effects of language, form and structure to be developed and to have a good level of detail? Again, I would say no, at least in relation to this short paragraph. There is little development. We just have a single fairly obvious point about the effect of the use of imperatives, whilst nothing specific at all is said about the metaphor, a giant's strength. Thus, we are probably looking more at level 4, which doesn't require the good level of detail of the higher bands. What might a level 6 response look like? Angelo's use of imperatives such as be satisfied and be content in this scene highlights his position of authority within Vienna. However, given that he is unable to appear immediately at the very beginning of the scene because he is hearing of a cause, the audience may well get the impression that his draconian crackdown is a demanding, time-consuming business. The imperatives may also reflect increasing impatience and irritation at having to listen to Isabella's impassioned arguments. Nonetheless, it becomes clear that Isabella's arguments are beginning to affect Angelo, particularly her use of imagery. She suggests that it is excellent to have a giant's strength, but tyrannous to use it like a giant's. This phrase starts with an apparently positive recognition of the scale of Angelo's power as temporary ruler of Vienna. He has so much power that it is almost as though he has taken on a superhuman form and strength. However, she then switches to suggest that inappropriate, aggressive, uncivilized use of such power can result in unfair, terrifying cruelty, such as might be dished out by some kind of megalomaniac dictator. How does this meet the criteria within level 6 for AO2? Well, note the developments. I suggest that the imperatives may stem not just from his position of authority, but also his sense that listening to this woman bang on may be using up valuable time. Notice also the level of detail when exploring the effect of Isabella's imagery. I unpick the image of a giant's strength to suggest that it has resulted in Angelo feeling almost superhuman with what he can and can't do. Whilst I explore the simile tyrannous to use it like a giant's, and suggest that Isabella is highlighting the potential cruelty that can stem from those suddenly invested with enormous power. Reflecting on this paragraph, I wonder whether I could make it even better. Thus, I add, nonetheless, it is important to note that Isabella doesn't dare to use the second person and instead talks apparently more generally in the third person by saying it is excellent, etc. This indirect attack thus potentially protects her from being accused of slander and also shows her own political sense of the need for a level of diplomacy. Can you see how much more development and detail there is in this response compared to the original one I showed you? So here's another short extract from Act 2, Scene 2. Have a go now at writing a mini section A response to this, aiming to explore the language, form and structure in splendidly developed detail. Press pause. This video will resume in 5 seconds time. I write, in this scene, Isabella begins to systematically question and challenge Angelo's stance on authority and justice. Rather than attack him directly, she refers generically to how human beings in power can fail to act proportionately and humanely, and declares, could great men thunder as Jove himself does, Jove would ne'er be quiet. Within Roman mythology, Jove was the king of the gods, and so thus capable of unleashing thunder and lightning upon the world. The implication here is that men with authority can become power-crazed and utterly carried away by the thrill of showcasing their strength, just as it would clearly be inappropriate and distorting for there to be near-permanent displays of thunder and lightning. Thus Isabella is implying that men in power need to be far more discriminate when electing to implement the strongest penalties, such as sentencing a fornicator such as her brother Claudio to death for consensual, loving sex. How does this meet the top band of the Marx scheme? Note the explanation of the reference to Jove. He was the king of the gods, and so thus capable of extraordinary displays of universe-wide power. But then, of course, I need to return to why Isabella is using the image and the effect of it. It is to highlight the point that humans in authority can act totally disproportionately just because they have this extraordinary power and they want the thrill of using it, rather than because it is actually the right thing to do. Overall, well-developed and consistently detailed discussion of effects of language, form, and structure. It's now time for you to have a go at a full question. We're going back an act to Act 1, Scene 2. I'm conscious that in different editions the line numbers can be slightly different, and so the passage will appear at 5-second intervals from this slide. Press pause to write down the question and to get writing. Here's my response in full. In this extract, Claudio is about to be taken off to prison as the first high-profile victim of Angelo's purging of Vienna. He freely confesses to his friend Lucio that he has technically broken the law by sleeping with Juliet before their marriage was finalised. Nonetheless, he feels understandably frustrated that he should be made an example of, and so begs for his help. On stage, the audience is likely to be amused by the contrast between Lucio and Claudio's references to the sexual act, which led to the latter's sentencing. Early on in this extract, Lucio questions indignantly whether lechery is so looked after, before making this comment about the perilousness of Claudio's situation. Thy head stands so tickle on thy shoulders that the milkmaid, if she be in love, may sigh it off. Lucio's use of the noun lechery implies that the sexual act was exclusively triggered by lust and dirty sexual desire, whilst the later combination of head and milkmaid conjures up images of maidenhead or virginity. Yes, Lucio's main meaning is that Claudio's head is so close to being cut off that a woman could figuratively blow it off. However, the echoes of maidenhead, particularly to a contemporary audience, and the phrasing sigh it off to a modern one imply the feelings of delight for men when conquering female virginity or receiving oral sex. Claudio is clearly used to Lucio's lewdness and sees it as part of his friend's character. Thus he's not offended by what other, more sensitive souls might see as a cheapening of his relationship with Juliet. However, it is notable that his descriptions of his sexual relationship with Juliet are far more dignified. He got possession of Julieta's bed upon a true contract. She is fast my wife, save that we do the denunciation lack of outward order. The adjective true confirms Claudio's honourable intent. There is no deceit or anything underhand at play, unlike, you might add, in the rest of the play, particularly when it comes to the Duke. Similarly, he confirms the strength of their relationship with the slightly misleading main clause, "She is fast my wife," in which fast is likely to refer to the fact the pair are already bound, fastened together. This explicit main clause comes before a subordinate clause which points out that they haven't yet completed a public marriage ceremony, and highlights the fact that in Claudio's mind he is effectively married to the woman he loves, hence the fact their lovemaking was most mutual entertainment. Their sex wasn't just for the man's selfish benefit, as in Lucio's viewpoint perhaps, but about glorious shared loving fun, hence the use of the superlative. Unsurprisingly, given his open declaration about the sincerity of his feelings for Juliet, Claudio criticises Angelo's decision to imprison him, although it is notable that his comments are thoughtful and measured, rather than raging and incoherent, which you might expect given that he might never clasp eyes upon his unborn child. He uses imagery in which he suggests that the body public may be a horse whereon the governor doth ride, and on which lets it straight feel the spur. The suggestion here is that Angelo has extraordinary power as the new temporary leader of Vienna, so much so that he is effectively a different species. Horses are bred and trained to be useful to human beings. Their own desires and feelings are not considered at any point. Thus, this metaphor suggests that Angelo views the citizens as inferior creatures who need to be trained to follow his every edict. A spur is a sharp device used to prick the side of a horse to ensure it follows the rider's instructions. The implication here is that Angelo is prepared to cause a degree of physical harm very quickly, so that the people are under no illusions that his commands must be followed. However, although modern audiences may gasp disbelievingly at the idea that someone could be sentenced to death for a premarital romp culminating in pregnancy, Claudio recognises that Angelo is simply following the letter of the law, albeit a drowsy and neglected law which, like unscoured armour hung by the wall, has not been touched for 19 years. The simile implies the brutality of the sentence through the reference to equipment worn during warfare, whilst unscoured or uncleaned, unpolished gives a visual representation of how this law has not been handled or thought of for such a long period. Thus, the impression we get of Angelo is that he may be more of a one-size-fits-all pedant, rather than a ruler who may be capable of using compassion and judgment in order to clean up Vienna. It is notable that Claudio repeats the phrase "for a name," and this adds a further dimension to the impression of Angelo acquired during the scene. As well as being pedantic, he may be more interested in making a name for himself, being known as an iron man of justice, rather than someone who presides over fair, nuanced judgments. The scene ends with the audience wondering whether Claudio's nun-in-training sister may be able to persuade Angelo to change his mind. Particularly intriguing is the suggestion that she has a prone and speechless dialect such as move men. What might he mean with the oxymoronic phrase speechless dialect? Could this indicate other non-spoken forms of communication, such as body language? And how might a man whose appetite is more to bread than stone respond to this? Now think back to the mark scheme. How does this respond meet the top bound for AO1 and, more crucially, given its weighting, AO2? The mark scheme is on screen now, and my answer will appear at 5-second intervals so that you can ponder this question. Press pause to do this now. What did you pick out? What notes did you make? The longer you spend doing this, the more likely you are going to approach your next section A in an even more thoughtful, effective way. It's too easy to churn out responses without really thinking sharply about what the examiner is looking for. Anyway, let's pick out 10 features from this extended paragraph. Feature number 1. Show the examiner that you have read the passage carefully and you have a decent overview of what happens, how the characters are feeling, and any interesting dynamics on stage. Next, at the start of the first main paragraph, make a clear point about something which interests you about the passage. In this case, I focus on the contrast between the way two characters refer to the same thing. I quite like the idea of presenting contrasts in language. Arguably, it can help present a more sophisticated understanding. Even more importantly than in section B, you want to get a quotation in quickly. How else can you accrue AO2 marks if you haven't got any language form and structure to specifically refer to? Make sure you embed this quotation seamlessly within your sentence and don't copy more of the text than you need. Just as importantly, ensure that the quotation contains some interesting, more complex words. Otherwise, it will be like trying to get blood out of a stone. If you're doing A-level English literature, it's safe to presume you can easily identify technical features of language, such as nouns, adjectives, similes, metaphors, personification, as well as the more advanced features which can crop up in Shakespearean plays, polysyndeton, asyndeton, or rhetorical devices like chiasmus or anaphora. If you feel a bit hazy on these, you might like to watch a few of my GCSE videos, GCSE Revision Guide, Achieving a Grade 9 for Persuasive Transactional Writing. But simply within the extract on screen, I've specified that lechery is a noun. Having given an interesting quotation, you want to talk specifically about its effects, what it implies, and any connotations. But remember the mark scheme, remember the specific comments about analysis being well developed and consistently detailed. Thus in this paragraph, I've added 2 further sentences following my initial exploration of effects. Remember also that in English, there is some scope for creativity. Thinking about modern perversities, it strikes me that 21st century audiences may interpret a milkmaid sighing something off in disgracefully crude fashion. So I include this possible interpretation along with a comment about how a Jacobean audience might respond to a different detail. In doing so, I'm exploring dramatic effects. The mark scheme doesn't just require you to show a well-developed and consistently detailed discussion of language, but form and structure too. Notice here how I explore the structure of Claudio's utterance. The fact that he kicks off with a main clause which claims Juliet is his wife, before modifying this statement in the subsequent subordinate clause, shows clearly to the audience that in his mind, he feels married to the pregnant lass, which thus makes us as the audience wonder whether Angelo has really chosen the right man to kick off his public purging. Try to avoid bland, boring, overly obvious points at the beginning of your paragraphs. The first sentence on screen now is rather long, but it aims to make an interesting contrast between how an audience might expect Claudio to react and the impressively restrained, articulate reality. Arguably, Shakespeare's greatest achievement is the richness of his imagery. If there is any imagery within your exam passage, and the chances are that there will be, for God's sake quote it and explore it in detail. Don't be afraid to make fairly obvious sounding points about the images in order to add precision to your analysis, something I aim to do when I specify the subservient position of horses and what this suggests about Angelo's dismissive attitude to those within his power. Finally, always look to develop your points as much as possible. Don't move too quickly onto a new point. My development here is triggered by shifting my attention to a different word within the quotation, spur. Does this man Angelo have some repressed sadistic desires within his soul, perhaps rather like the woman he developed such a fascination for? Here are the first 5 tips again. Which ones do you think are particularly useful for you? And the second set of 5 tips. The same question. Which ones will you propel to the front of your thinking when attempting another Section A task?
I charge you, O women, for the love you bear to men, to like as much of this video as please you. And I charge you, O men, for the love you bear to women, as I perceive by your simpering, none of you hates them, that between you and the women, this video may please. I hope it has been mildly useful and increased the chance of you achieving the full 15 marks in Section A of the Shakespeare question for the OCR English Literature, Drama and Poetry pre-1900 paper. Many thanks for watching.